All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. This is our fifth of kind of 5 Friday webinars that we're recording and then also sharing via the Facebook group that we've got going. So some of you are watching this recorded via that link through our Facebook group. And some of you are watching live here today. We'll probably do another series of these down the road a little bit. We don't have any scheduled at the current moment, but I think we will continue to offer some of these as we go forward here in the fall and winter as well. So today's topic is going to be kind of the latest on the stimulus package for individuals. So we've done some things with businesses. We've talked specifically about some of the ag programs in the last few weeks. So today, we just wanted to talk about farmers and ranchers just as people or community members and, talk a little bit about that. Now, when we set this up 6 weeks ago, I was fully expecting that we would have a second round of stimulus to be talking about, which we do not have. So we're going to do a little bit of a summary about what's gone on so far and what what programs are still available, some actions you might want to take, and maybe talk a little bit about what might happen coming up in the future. So feel free to send any messages in via the chat window, and we'll try to get to those when we can. All right, so first I wanted to kind of give a little overview of kind of the landscape. That first of all, there was some federal legislation, and there's kind of been two big acts, but several smaller acts that added some new legislation that created some of the stimulus payments. So those were voted on by both houses of Congress and then signed by the president. One of the CARES Act specifically transferred a fair bit of spending money to the states, and then the states were then able to create some rules on how they spent those things as well. So we'll talk about some state programs that are really kind of under the umbrella of the federal legislation, but then the states each got to decide how it was best to use that within their particular state. There's also been some kind of stimulus-related actions that were handled via agency rules and executive orders. So these weren't laws that went through Congress. These were just authority that either the president already had, or just like the IRS had some authority to change some things as well, and didn't require legislative action. So some of those things, the stimulus program, part of it falls under those components as well. Now, at the state level, we also have had some executive orders, which is from the governor's office, that didn't require legislative rule changes. And we've also had some agency rules as well. Now, in Montana, we haven't had any legislative stimulus because our legislature has not been in session since the coronavirus started. They will start meeting in January of 2021. So everything on the state level has been handled either via state executive orders or through agency rule changes. Also then following through on spending some of the dollars that were allocated by the federal legislation through one of those earlier acts. So we'll kind of talk about the three pieces of those with some of these things. So just kind of a highlight of a few things that we've already kind of experienced, and some of these are ongoing and some are sort of past us. So first of all, the normal income tax filing deadline of April 15th of 2020 was moved forward to July 15th. So for folks that hadn't filed their taxes by late March, when that law came out, they were allowed to then wait and not file on October 15th if they chose to. And about 13 million filers nationwide. Well, no, that's not quite true. I don't know how many Montanans took advantage of the late filing option. However, those that were going to get a refund and normally would have filed by April 15th, but instead chose to file, say, July 15th, the IRS actually paid interest on those refunds that would have come to folks because they normally would have sent those checks out earlier. So it amounted to about $20 per return that was in that situation. And those went out, I think, about 2 weeks ago. So if you were one of those folks that filed late and then you got a small payment later on, it was interest on that check that you normally would have received earlier. The first act too, there was a Families First Act, provided two new programs dealing with sick leave. And the two programs work together. They are slightly different, but they're designed to sort of interact with each other. And I've got a flyer at the end we can look in a little more detail, but essentially what it did is it provided reimbursements to employers to offer these two types of sick leave. And the first one was this maximum of 80 hours. Employee gets paid at their normal rate. And that's essentially for people that had to quarantine or actually got coronavirus and then had to, stay away from work for a short period of time. So that's just a 2-week period. The second one was the emergency family medical leave portion, and this only pays a portion of the employee's salary. I think it was 2/3, and there's some maximums for higher paid folks, and there's also some minimums for lower paid workers where it might not be quite that 2/3 number, but it's a maximum of 12 weeks, but you can't get it the first 2 weeks because you're essentially getting the maximum of 80 hours has to expire first on the other program. But this one was also for family members. So if you had a member of your household that got quarantined, or their school closed, or there was a stay-at-home order, and you were not able to go to work in that case, the second one here pays a little less, but it's much broader in terms of who's eligible. Now, not every employer offered these. So you had to be a covered employer, which meant you had to be, definition of small here, which is less than 500 employees, which in Montana, we don't have a whole lot of employers that have more than 500 employees. Some of our hospitals, the university system, those folks do. But there are a few places where you might work for the local office may only have 20 employees, but it's a national corporation. So in total, it's much more than 500. But so this was only for employers that had less than 500 on the private side. Most public sector employees are covered as well. But then there were some waivers for employers that have less than 50 employees. So they could, the employer could apply for a waiver that said, we only have 3 employees. If I grant 2 of them this leave, it would jeopardize the ongoing viability of my business. So there were some waivers that could be applied for at the employer level for those smaller employees with less than 50, which I know in eastern Montana, that's probably an awful lot of our employers are in that category. And I don't have any numbers about how many employers chose to apply for those waivers at all. So those are the two kind of programs on the sick leave side. And those are still ongoing. So if your employer was a covered one and is offering these, this is not something that was only available over the summer. It is still available if you as an employee haven't utilized it. One of the bigger kind of headline items was the CARES Act, which gave the cash rebates to individuals, and that was $1,200 per qualified taxpayer, and that was for an adult. You had to be over 18, have a work eligible Social Security number. If you made over 75,000, that $1,200 started to reduce, and it sort of stepped down. By the time you're making 100,000, it's zero. So if you made over 100,000, you wouldn't be eligible. And then most dependents, so your kids, were eligible for 500. So if you're a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, maybe age 11 and 13, your payment's likely going to be $3,400, which would be $1,200 for each adult and $500 for each child. Now, the rollout of this was a little bit logistically challenging. There's something in the range of 160 million checks that needed to be sent, or direct deposits. So they were able to gather data from your IRS. So if you've been getting your refund electronically, they were able to get that information and pull it in. They were also able to work with Social Security and get bank account information that way. So they tried to do the vast majority of these via direct deposit. Then they went to paper checks at the rate of about 5 million a week to try to catch up with folks they didn't have bank account information for. Some folks also got prepaid debit cards as another way to get that out there. And this is actually kind of based on, if you remember, in 2008, at the very end of the George Bush administration, they gave $200 or $250 payments, and the logistics of that took months and months, and there were not very many direct deposit information available, and the Treasury was not allowed to work with the Social Security system to get bank account information. So they learned a lot from what happened with the logistics in 2008 to kind of improve the rollout of this. Now, there's still some gaps. People that normally don't make enough income to be required to file a tax return, so they legally don't have to file one. We're kind of falling through the gaps in some cases. So there's a tool on the IRS website, which is the link I gave you there, where you can actually enter your information. If you're one of those folks who's not normally required to file, you are eligible for the payment, but you kind of have to tell them who you are. And so there's about 9 million people that the IRS thinks might still be eligible and have not received it. So they sent letters to those folks here just in the last week or so, asking them to please, by October 15th, go to the website that I listed there and register to get that payment. So they're going to determine eligibility on those folks. It's not a guarantee all 9 million are eligible, but they are trying to, catch the people that fell through the cracks. There is also one other possibility too. If you don't do this by October 15th, when you file your tax return in the spring of 2021, and were supposed to be eligible for this program, but didn't receive it, you'll actually be able to add it on and get it with your refund in the spring. So for these folks, if you miss this current deadline, doesn't mean you won't get it, just means you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. There's also kind of a bunch of smaller items that got thrown in here. Some are retirement related. So for folks under 59 and a half, if you took money out of a IRA or a 401k plan, you typically have to pay a 10% early withdrawal penalty and have taxable income on that. They've waived that early withdrawal penalty for this year. So folks that needed to tap into those funds a little bit easier. Also, when you withdraw money from a retirement account, they typically require you to withhold some income tax withholding. So just like your paycheck, you get the big number at the top and the smaller number is what goes to your bank account. Same thing happens with retirement distributions where you're prepaying your taxes. They have made that now voluntary through the end of the year, but it doesn't change its taxable amount. So if you were going to take $2,000 out, you would normally owe $200 on that. The fact that you don't withhold some just means your tax bill when you file your taxes in the spring is going to be higher. If you've already taken some money out, you can actually put it back in. They added that again, which is a little bit of a quirk. And you can spread that income over a number of years. So some flexibility for folks, probably not going to affect a lot of people, but there is some options for a few folks there. And then folks that are over 70 and a half are required to take some distributions from their 401k or IRA account. But for 2020, they've waived that. So you don't have to take your money if you don't want to. So again, a little bit of flexibility. For folks that, if their 401k plan allows people to borrow against their own balance as a loan, historically the maximum was 50% of your vested account balance. They have increased that to 100% of a vested account balance. So somebody that had a $200,000 balance in the past would have only been able to borrow $50,000. Now they're possibly able to borrow up to $100,000. Not all plans allow loans, but again, some flexibility that might impact some folks in Montana. Unemployment insurance was also one of the kind of big headline items. This was a big dollar program for individuals. A couple things. First, they waived kind of the 1 week waiting period that's been true of traditional unemployment benefits. And then they added what's called federal pandemic unemployment benefits on top of the normal benefits. So they added $600 a week to pretty much everybody that was on unemployment's benefits, which the average benefits in Montana are something like $400 a week. So this was more than doubling the normal benefits that are provided through unemployment. They also made some changes to allow what they're calling short-time compensation. So you're not unemployed, but you went from 40 hours a week to 20. There was now some benefits that people were eligible for there. Also, some self-employed individuals were eligible for the first time. Now the extra $600 a week, that ended in July. So it went for a number of weeks, but that program did sunset towards the end of July. So that was the CARES Act that provided that $600. And then we had a presidential executive order that used some spending authority under the Federal Emergency Management Act or agency, that they were able to take some funds that were allocated there and turn it into an additional $300 per week of unemployment benefits. So kind of replacing the $600 with 300. States had to kind of apply to get into this program, so it varied when this started by state. But that only lasted for either 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe 5 weeks, I forget. So that in Montana, that program ended September 5th, so some folks were able to benefit from that. And then the governor, Governor Bullock, added $100 to that 300 to make a total of 400 through that period, using some funding that was provided via the CARES Act to the states that then the states could decide how to use. So that happened in Montana. There were some changes on the healthcare side, some of them relatively small. First, telehealth services are covered specifically by Medicaid. This could have some really interesting long-term impacts for Eastern Montana, where we drive far distances to get access to some medical care. It's quite possible that telehealth will become more common as a way for someone in Eastern Montana to see a doctor in Billings, via this kind of option. So it's really greatly expanded the amount of telehealth that's going on. It'll be really interesting to see if that continues long term. Could have some really big implications for some of the rural areas of Montana. And then much more minor, for flex plans and healthcare savings accounts, the definition of eligible expenses expands to include over-the-counter medicines. So this was available about 10 years ago, and they actually got rid of it sort of as a trade-off to allow some funds to roll forward to the next plan year, so it wasn't quite use it or lose it. Now it's back, so things like ibuprofen, cold medicines, those kind of things are now eligible. So much smaller dollar item compared to some of the things we've seen previously, but a little bit of flexibility there. Now, originally, I heard that Montana medical care savings accounts were not going to follow this rule. Because of how the change was made and what the definition with the Montana medical care savings account is, there's kind of two ways they can define eligible expenses. The Montana one defers to one specific set of definitions at the federal level, and it turns out that the original law changed the other set of rules. So we'll see, I think, when the legislature meets in January, likely a small housekeeping bill will bring those two issues back in line. So. Mortgages, there was also some relief that came out this way. First being only for federally backed mortgages, which I think is well over 80% of mortgages in the country. These are the ones that are backed by Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, VA loans, FHA, HUD, some of the USDA programs. But there are some private mortgages that are held by local banks that are not through these. So these changes would not affect that type of loan. So foreclosure action, everything was suspended for 60 days from March 18th, and then that's slowly been lifted in a kind of a variety of ways. And then borrowers can request 180-day forbearance if they had a financial hardship. So that forbearance means you don't have to make loan payments, but your interest would continue to accrue on that loan. And then after that 180 days, you can actually request an additional 180 days, which is actually where a lot of borrowers are now that utilize this program. They're starting into the second 180 days if they wanted to. But one thing to note, they're not waiving anything or making any loan payments for you. So once you've ended your forbearance period, you'll have to negotiate with your lender. How do you make up for these lost payments? Will you add them on to the end of the loan? Will you increase your payments from now until the normally scheduled ending? Will you make a lump sum payment at some point? So those are things you'll have to work out with your lender. And we did have a question come in, which is a really good one. Is there a specific end date to these changes? So with respect to the retirement changes, most of those are for the calendar year 2020. and then we'll return to the traditional rules. With respect to the Medical Leave Act, it's at least good through the end of 2020. I would have to look and see what happens beyond that. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. With respect to this mortgage program here, once these 280-day periods have expired, that will be the end of this program unless some new legislation comes forward. So we're probably looking at 6 more months. The foreclosure stoppage or suspension of those activities is currently being lifted, and there's portions that are still in place, but my guess is by the end of the year, those waivers that are under this particular act will have expired. So a couple of great questions. Student loans, for folks that have student loans, a little more generous here in terms of flexibility for the borrower. So first of all, the interest rate was 0% from March 13th through the end of September. And these are on federal student loans, which is probably about 85 to 90% of the student loans that are out there. There are a few exceptions. You also can simply defer payments for this period too, so make no payments over the summer. And this is better than the home mortgage one in that interest isn't accruing. So if you had a $8,000 balance on June 1st and you applied for a deference of payments, when you start paying again now or in October, it remains at that exact same balance. You just got to pause, in taking care of that. Now you could have went ahead and continued to make payments and benefited from the lower interest rate, and they would pay off a little bit earlier than had they normally done so. So this is for federal loans, direct loans being the big one, and these family education loans. Those are by far the two biggest programs, but there are some other smaller programs. There's been a lot of changes to student loans over the last 20 years. So some of the loans that are maybe more than 10 years old, some of those are still privately held. That's why I put an asterisk on a few of these. And then by executive order, most of these were extended from September 30th out to December. And I've not seen the final details on how this last quarter will be handled. But I think it's going to be pretty similar to how the summer was handled. The CARES Act also allowed for a $300 above the line deduction for charitable contributions. So in the past, we kind of only needed to keep track of those records if we were going to itemize our tax return. The standard deduction is now, I think, about $12,000, which meant most Americans are no longer itemizing their deductions. But it looks like for the calendar year 2020, so the taxes you'll file in the spring, they're going to allow folks to take the standard deduction and take a $300 deduction if you made a charitable contribution. So keep track of at least $300 worth of your charitable contributions, and you'll be able to save a little bit on your taxes when you file them this spring. It also removes some maximum limits on how much you can deduct in a given year for folks. So kind of on the upper end, there might be some benefits there as well. So with that, let's take any questions we might have. It looks like we've had a couple come in by chat. So the first one is, can any of the stimulus packages or CARES Acts change with the election? And if so, what would that look like? So what I would say, most of the provisions of the changes I talked about were primarily for just the calendar year 2020. So whatever happens with the presidential or Senate or House of Representatives, election in November, those folks are not appointed, won't actually take their seat until January. At which point most of these would be expired. They were kind of short-term programs by and large. So I think what is probably more interesting with that is just whether it be any legislation that happens between now and January or after January, what additional legislation might we see? Will there be more short-term programs? I am fully expecting that there will be another stimulus package of some type that passes before the end of the calendar year, and I would not be surprised if it doesn't pass before the end of October. I am also getting the impression it might be slightly more targeted. So instead of broadly giving money, trying to give money to individuals and industries that have been hit hardest by um, the health implications and the economic slowdown sort of related to the coronavirus. So that's a good question. Let's see. Are there any websites with additional information? And yeah, I actually put those in. So here's a couple different websites I wanted to point out. You can also search the top one and you'll probably find it. It's kind of a long, messy one. But if you want some more information about the two sick leave programs, the Department of Labor, the lower of the second of the two links there has kind of more of the text version. The top one is just a one-page flyer that kind of gives an overview of the two programs. There are a number of kind of, I'd say, important details, but more than we could go into in this short presentation. And then Montana has a coronavirus relief program. So this is kind of how a lot of the dollars were spent that the federal government provided through the CARES Act. And then if you haven't received your $1,200 economic impact payment yet, you can go to this website, IRS coronavirus, then economic impacts, and provide your information there, and hopefully get caught up and get that payment to you if you're eligible for it. I'm going to show, I put in one more slide here if we had time. So this is where Montana has allocated out the funding that essentially came from the CARES Act through all these programs, and they carried a variety of different names. There were grants for live entertainment businesses. There were some Montana Business Stabilization grant program, which was one of the larger ones. There was a emergency housing assistance program, and some of these programs are still available. There's one for nonprofits that do social services that may have lost some revenue. But this is where these grants have been awarded so far. Some of these programs have closed. They've spent the money that they're going to spend. Others are still accepting applications. But they do have this picture, and if I think we have maybe a second here, I'll actually stop sharing this and go to the website, and I'll show you. Okay, let me share this other site. Okay, hopefully you're seeing something similar to what we were seeing, but then you see down here towards the bottom is this list of who got things. So I can click on, let's say Blaine County, and it actually lists under these different programs that are out there who they awarded money to in that county. So here we've got, a business adaptability grant. One of them went to the Fort Belknap Planning and Development Group, doing business as the Island Mountain Development Group, and that was a total of $10,000. So two different phases went to there. So you can certainly take a look and see what businesses in your community applied. They had a special program for private schools, and then public schools got some funding as well. There was a pretty big initiative. Early on, there were some challenges with national meat packing plants and keeping their workers healthy, and there was a slowdown in processing. So one of the responses to that was Governor Bullock took some of the money from the CARES Act and provided it to these meat processing facilities in Montana to expand their capacity. So they were allowed to put in some grants and apply for, some additional equipment or freezer storage or whatever it might be. And we're seeing one of those here for Bear Paw Meats. But again, as sort of a response to a slowdown in the national, kind of processing capacity. So, but you can certainly check into these and see where some of that money went and which programs. And if we can also click on the side here and see, like, there is a housing assistance program. And if you wanted to apply for it, the button's right here on this same website. And these are the different coronavirus relief programs. You can get information on it or submit your application as well. So, all right. Are there other questions or comments? So one thing, we don't have any future Friday webinars scheduled at the moment, but I think it's likely we'll schedule another group down the road a little bit. So stay in touch with the Facebook group or your contact at your local tribal college, and we'll try to let you know of kind of any future offerings that we've got through kind of this venue. Carrie, did you want to add anything else to that, or?
Nope.
I'm not sure we've got a good audio connection there, so.
No.
Well, maybe I'll just do the kind of wrap up from here. Feel free to send any questions to myself. I'll get in touch with any of the MSU team if we need to, or to Liz at Fort Belknap or Ani Nakota College there to help reach out in that community, or to Wendy Becker as well, or to Kate Fuller or Carrie Schumacher. And we're happy to, if we have ideas for future sessions, we're happy to do those, or ask for clarification about any of the things we've presented on. We're happy to get you in touch with the presenters on those. So, well, thanks everybody for joining us, and watch for kind of additional offerings as we move forward into the fall.